Guys, we're starting a new chapter today, and it's combining two shorter chapters, public opinion and voting in elections, okay? And they don't necessarily go together completely, but there's a good segue between the two that'll help us kind of merge those topics together. And we'll go through public opinion pretty fast. Let's first of all talk about this. What is public opinion? All right. Public opinion is a set of preferences that people have about issues, ideas, or other individuals. Okay? It's a set of preferences that people have about issues, ideas, or other people. All right. So if we ask, for example, what the public thinks about government-sponsored healthcare for everyone, right? That would be an issue or an idea that we want to know what the public thinks. It's a set of public preferences because we know, not everybody's going to agree about it. Okay? Public opinion is a set of preferences that people have about issues, ideas, or other people. Okay? And uh, how do we find out what the public is thinking about a particular issue? And that's easy. You just ask them. All right. When you want to know what the public thinks about something, you just talk to them. All right. People are generally honest how they feel about political issues. Okay. And so public opinion, we measure this by polling people. All right. That's what we're doing when we're conducting a public opinion poll. We're asking people, how do you feel about this issue, this idea, this particular person? We ask people, it's a common polling question, do you approve or disapprove of the way that the president is handling his job? Right. And then, we let people respond to that. Okay. And there are several purposes for polling. One of the things that we want to do with polling is we want to measure people's thoughts to inform our political leaders. Okay? That way, our leaders can make decisions in part based on what the people think. All right? And yes, what the people think does matter. Remember, this is a democracy. Consent of the governed is important. All right? And if political leaders want back into office, then they better consider what their constituents, the people they represent, have to say on an issue. Okay? So, purpose number one, we want to measure thoughts so that we can inform our leaders. All right? Now, another purpose of polls is we want to measure knowledge. Okay? Oftentimes, it's not asking people just their opinion on a matter, but it's also asking them what they know. Okay? And we do that in part to try to figure out if people's opinions are valid. And here's an example. Okay? If we ask the question, do you approve or disapprove the way that President Trump is handling his job? All right? And let's say that 55% disapprove and 45% approve. All right? And obviously, that's a concern. However, all right, one of the things you want to do is you want to measure knowledge so that we find out if people's opinions are accurately based. So we might ask a question of name a policy that President Trump has implemented during his time in office. All right. And if people can't name at least one policy or something that Trump has done, then maybe we don't pay as much attention to the fact that people are disapproving of him. And the same was true with President Obama. What we find out a lot of times is that people don't like a politician, but they're not sure why. So we want to measure people's knowledge. We want to know if they understand why they don't like a politician, why they don't like a particular event. All right. So one of the purposes of polls is obviously to measure people's knowledge to inform leaders, but we also want to measure their knowledge about these issues. Okay. A third reason we use polls is to make predictions, right? We use polling to make predictions. Throughout the presidential election and congressional elections, we're constantly polling people to see who they're potentially going to vote for, right? And that helps us figure out, like it helps people figure out their strategy, to figure out what policies might be coming down the road. Uh, and polls, a lot of times they're being critiqued as not necessarily accurate. But you're going to find out. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. That polls are generally very accurate. Okay, so we're measuring thoughts to inform leaders. We're measuring knowledge, and we also want to make predictions. Okay, but there's a few other things that we want to measure in here too, some terms that you might not be familiar with. All right. One of the things we measure is people's intensity about a particular issue or subject or person. And intensity, That measures how strongly you feel about a particular issue or person. Okay. And so let's say that we ask the question of, do you believe that recreational marijuana should be legalized in this country? Yes or no. All right. And uh, somebody might feel really strongly about that. Like, let's say that I really believe that marijuana should be legalized in this country, and you can't get me to change my mind about that. I'm just not moving off that position. You could say, you're pretty intense about that. You're pretty strong. You got strong feelings on that particular issue. Not changing my mind. All right. Generally, here is like that's an I take that back. I don't think there's necessarily any issues that people are always intense about because people feel strongly about different issues. Okay. And that's a little bit different than what we call salience. All right. Salience. Salience is how you prioritize the issues that are important to you. All right. And salience isn't the same thing as intensity. Salience is how you prioritize them. So, for example, let's go with that same issue. Remember, let's pretend that recreational marijuana, I'm not at all going to be moved on that issue. I feel very strongly about marijuana being legalized, but it's not a salient issue for me. All right. That means that it's low on my priority list. There's 20, 30, 40 policies I would love to see changed before I start thinking about how important marijuana is to me. Because even if it's legalized, I'm not doing marijuana, so it's not going to affect my life. All right. That's not a big issue for me. Okay. As a teacher right now, in the last 5 years especially, education policy, that's more salient to me. Okay. It's a high priority for me. Whereas, like, let's say we talk to a senior citizen, somebody who doesn't have any kids, and they are 70 years old, and the priorities for them might be things like Medicare and Social Security and making sure those get funded. All right. Or tax rates, tax policy. That's salient for them. Okay. So you can be intense on an issue and it could be very low on your priority list. And start thinking about that. Be able to kind of list or come up with a list of what issues are salient for you. For some people, maybe it's abortion. For some people, maybe it is education. Some people, maybe it's student loans. All right. What types of government policies are most salient to you? All right. So our purposes for public opinion polls to try to measure public opinion is we want to figure out what thoughts are so that we can inform leaders. We want to measure people's knowledge. We want to make predictions. We want to figure out how intense people feel about issues and what is salient to them. And remember, what you're intense about or what you have as a high priority is not the same as what other people might think. Right? So when we're asking people, when we're polling people, uh, there's a way to go about doing this, and it's become very scientific. Okay, um, when we want to know what 330 million Americans think, it's simply not feasible to try to talk to every single one of them. All right. So what we do is we collect a random sample, much like if we were trying to study the soil composition of the soccer field. We wouldn't dig up the whole soccer field. We would just take a few samples randomly out of the ground, and we could look at those random samples and figure out what the soil composition is like throughout the whole soccer field. So if we took like 10 random samples, that are, maybe a core sample from six different locations on the soccer field, and all the numbers come back that they have similar levels of chemicals or nutrients in them, then we could conclude that it's pretty consistent throughout the soccer field. Okay. Now, a random sample. There's 330 million Americans. And if we want to know what 330 million Americans think about an issue, how many of them do we need to talk to before we get a good random sample or a good idea of what people think? And the number is going to surprise you. You only need about 1,000 to 2,000 people to get a good random sample, right? And a lot of people are like, that sounds ridiculous. Polling 2,000 people to represent what 330 million think. And the answer is, yeah, it actually works. All right. And we'll show you how that works out in a second. Okay. Now, with every public opinion poll, they would tell you this, that it's not 100% accurate. Okay? There's always a margin of error. You like that? Margarine of error. Get it? Margarine. Oh, come on. Anyway, all right. Here's what we mean: a margin of error. Okay, a plus or minus, and you'll see a percentage number. All right. So plus or minus 3%. So if I said that 45% of Americans approve of the way President Trump is handling his job, and we said the margin of error was 3%, that means that his approval could be as high as 48% and as low as 42%. All right. We're pretty sure that it falls within that range. Now, uh, that in of itself, a margin of error, you want to keep it 3% or less, because when you start getting more than that, you just get such a wide range. Like, think about this for a second. Let's say that we did a poll in the Cabell County area. Is Mr. Scalise a good teacher or not? All right. And let's say that 50% of respondents said Mr. Scalise is a good teacher, and our margin of error was 7%. That means it could be as high as 57% and as low as 43%. And that range is a little high. And we're like, oh, we're pretty confident it falls in that range. Well, that's all well and good, but I mean, trained monkeys could come up with that conclusion, all right? So you want to keep that margin of error really low. And the lower your margin of error, okay, the lower your margin of error, obviously, you feel more confident about the poll. All right. Now, calculating that margin of error, and I'll just show you this real fast. There's a great website. If you just put in Google search margin of error calculator, you'll come up with this. It's on Good Calculators. All right. And so let's take a look at how we do this. When you come up with this, they'll even show you the math itself when you put this out. The sample size. Let's say that we have 1,000 people we're going to poll, and we're looking at the entire country. So we're going to put in the population size as 300 million. Okay. And so we're going to put our confidence level at 95%. And I'll tell you what that means here in a second. Okay. So when you put in this figure that we're polling 1,000 people out of 330 million, we have a margin of error of 3.099%. And that's pretty good. Okay. And when we have our confidence level, what we're saying is we are 95% confident that our poll of 1,000 people represents 330 million at a margin of error of 3%. Now, if you want to decrease the margin of error, what should you do? How do you get your poll to be a little more accurate and lower that margin of error? Right? The answer is you start polling more people. Let's say we take our sample size from 1,000 to 2,000. Calculate, and look what this has done. The margin of error is now 2.191%, significantly lower. Okay? And as you go up, like as you increase the polling, you're going to slowly decrease that margin of error. All right. And let's say we polled 30,000 people instead of just 3,000. Look at that. You got your margin of error. It's so negligible. That means you're pretty sure that you're accurate. All right. So we go back to 3,000 for a minute. If we polled 3,000 people throughout the country, we could get a really accurate poll. Now, we could increase the confidence level. Okay. If we want, let's say we want to be 99.99% sure that our poll is accurate. Okay. If we had a sample size of 3,000 people out of 330 million people, we could say that we're 99.99% sure that our poll is accurate in that range, in that margin of error. Okay. Now, you can do this for smaller areas too. All right. One of the neat things, and let's go back and put our confidence level at 95%. Okay. Now, 95% is kind of considered the going rate, the going standard on how to do this. But let's say we didn't want to poll all of Americans. Let's say we just wanted to poll West Virginians. And West Virginia population is about 1.8 million people, right? If we polled 3,000 people in the state of West Virginia, we'd have a pretty good margin of error at one point, just below 1.8%, right? And even if we raise the confidence level, we'd still have a good margin of error, right? Let's say we polled 30,000 people in West Virginia. Look at that margin of error. See, it goes down. Now, literally, what would happen if you polled all 1.8 million people in West Virginia? What would happen to your margin of error? And the answer would be it disappeared. There is no margin of error if you polled everybody. Okay. So that's how they calculate it. You can plug the numbers in yourself, and they'll give you the formula about how to do this and what it stands for. I don't have time to go through that right now. If you want to talk about the statistical analysis, go see Adam Riazzi. All right. That's his world, not mine. This is why I like the calculator. Now, moving right along, let's go back to the issue of polling. Okay. We are asking people their thoughts about particular issues or people. We get a random sample. There's a margin of error. And when you get a low margin of error, you're pretty successful at this. There are reasons that companies literally all they do is polling and they get paid to do it, right? There are companies out there, and most famously the Gallup poll. People will contract them to do polling for them. Politicians, as part of their campaign, they want to know how they're doing in the campaign and what issues are important to voters. All right. And so it's important that pollsters get this right. And they're actually really good at it. When you look at the predictions they make for elections, you're going to find out that they go through every single state. Like, for example, people get onto them because in 2016, they were wrong. And it's like, look, they got 48 out of the 50 states right. And two of the states that they got wrong were such narrow margins, all right, that, it was literally a virtual toss up. So polling institutions are actually very good at this and they have a high success rate. All right. Now, one of the things that matters in terms of getting an accurate public opinion poll is getting the question wording correct. The way you word the questions will have an impact on the results. Okay? And so here's an example of how that would play out. What if I ask this question? Okay? Uh, let's say this. Do you believe that all Americans should have access to health care? Right? What do you think people would say to that? Most people would say, absolutely, yes, people should have access to health care. Okay? However, what if you change the question to this? Should all Americans have access to health care, even if it means a government-sponsored healthcare program like Medicare? Right? What do you think that would do to the percentage of yeses that you would get? And it would probably decrease because people are like, wait a second, nobody mentioned anything about taxes and government programs. So ultimately, you want your questions to be as narrow and as specific as possible so that you can get the best results. Narrowly worded questions, free from bias. Okay, you don't want biased questions. Okay, wording the questions is important. You want narrow questions with little to no bias in them. All right. And sometimes it's hard to get rid of bias completely. So you have to have other people really look at these questions for you. Okay. Now, here's an example of bias that most people wouldn't necessarily, see all the time. What if we asked a question like this? Or how about this? Which do you believe has more of a negative effect? The Democratic Party or the Republican Party? Okay. Well, basically what we've done is we've already implied that both of them have a negative impact on society. All right. By saying which ones do you think have a negative, or which one do you think has the more negative effect? You're implying to them that both of them do have a negative effect. All right. And that's going to affect the way people respond to your questions. So a better way would be to ask separately questions like, do you have a positive or negative view of the Democratic Party? Do you have a positive or negative view of the Republican Party? You have to really think about the way that these questions are worded and the way that, sometimes bias sneaks in. Okay. Now, what's also interesting is that you want your answers. Do you want open-ended answers to be there where you let people just respond, or do you want a set of limited responses? And I promise you that you want a set of limited responses. Okay? Uh, because if you have an open-ended question like, what do you think of President Trump? How many different responses would you get? And not to mention, if you were the one doing the polling, you'd be on the phone for forever. All right. So you have to have questions that are worded narrowly, very specifically, very narrowly. They have to be free from bias. Okay. And you have to have a limited set of responses. Right? Now, we've been talking about polling in terms of the good uses for polling and how it's an important aspect of measuring people's thoughts and knowledge, and how elected officials care about this. But some people use polls for evil. Ooh, yes, for evil. Okay, and what you see sometimes are what we refer to as push polls. Okay, and push polls don't care about actually measuring public opinion. They're designed to push you in a certain direction. They're biased on purpose so that they can sway public opinion. All right. And here's an example. Let me give you a recap, and this will just kind of blow your mind a little bit. Right during 2000, during the presidential election of 2000, in the Republican primary, George W. Bush was a decently known candidate, but former Senator John McCain was considered the front runner early on. And George Bush knew that he had to do something dramatic going into the third primary election of the season, which happened to be in South Carolina. And so, to drum up support for himself and run down John McCain, Bush's people did what we would call a push poll. It's like a fake opinion poll. And here's one of the questions that they asked. Voters in South Carolina reportedly were asked before the 2000 Republican primary, would you be more or less likely to vote for John McCain for president if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? Okay. That is a push poll question if there ever was one. Okay. Now, notice this too. All right. And people try to defend this by saying, hey, we did not say that John McCain had fathered an illegitimate black child. We're saying, theoretically, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain if you knew that he did father an illegitimate black child? Now, you have to remember the context too. This is in South Carolina, which is a very traditional society where there's a lot of racial hostility that goes back a long way. So, for Republicans to hear this, and imagine getting this robocall, um, for Republicans to hear this, that John McCain and his wife, who are as white as snow, uh, that they had a marriage and John McCain fathered an illegitimate black child, that to them was scandalous in the worst possible way. Okay, and people are like, hey, if the voters, the people we contact for the polling, aren't smart enough to figure this out, that's not our problem. Okay, now here's what makes it even worse. Okay, John McCain and his wife, who had a couple children of their own, all right, they had adopted a child from Bangladesh. Okay, and little kids from Bangladesh have very dark skin. So when John McCain and his family are on the campaign trail and voters see the McCain family, including this little dark skinned child, they think the rumor is true. And what do you think happens to John McCain in the South Carolina primary? He gets toasted. He gets destroyed. And part of the reason why is that this push poll pushed South Carolina Republican voters away from John McCain. All right. And McCain held a grudge against George Bush for a long time over this. Bush tried to claim that he didn't know it happened, his people weren't behind it, but I don't know about that. All right. Think of this for a minute, too. Let's say I'm going to use as an example here, we'll use Miss Wise as an example. Would you be more likely or less likely to vote for Miss Wise as best teacher ever if you knew that she kicked puppies? Right? I'm not saying she does kick puppies, but if we did, then would you be more likely or less likely? And for some people, we've planted the idea in their mind that, well, wait a second, maybe Miss Wise does kick puppies. Hmm. All right. Push polls are more common than what you would think. All right. We'll pick up with that tomorrow, kids.